Hello, and welcome back for the second part of Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid. Let's find out what adventures she's going to have and see what's going to happen in this story. I hope you enjoy it. Sit back, relax, and have a listen. When, for the first time in her life, she appeared on the surface of the water, the sun had just sunk below the horizon. The clouds were beaming with bright golden and rosy hues. The evening star was shining in the pale western sky. The air was mild and refreshing, and the sea as smooth as a looking-glass. A large ship with 3 masts lay on the still waters. One sail only was unfurled, but not a breath was stirring, and the sailors were quietly seated on the cordage and ladders of the vessel. Music and song resounded from the deck, and after it grew dark, hundreds of lamps all of a sudden burst forth into light, whilst innumerable flags were fluttering overhead. The little mermaid swam close up to the captain's cabin, and every now and then, when the ship was raised by the motion of the water, she could look through the clear window panes. She saw within many richly dressed men. The handsomest among them was a young prince with large black eyes. He could not certainly be more than 16 years old, and it was in honour of his birthday that a grand festival was being celebrated. The crew were dancing on the deck, and when the young prince appeared among them, 100 rockets were sent up into the air, turning night into day, and so terrifying the little mermaid that for some minutes she plunged back beneath the water. However, she soon raised her head a little again, and it seemed as if all the stars were falling down upon her. Such a fiery shower she had never seen before. Never had she heard that men possessed such wonderful powers. Large suns revolved around her, bright fishes swam in the air, and everything was reflected perfectly on the clear surface of the sea. It was so light in the ship that everything could be seen distinctly. Oh, how happy the young prince was! He shook hands with the sailors, laughed and jested with them, while sweet notes of music mingled with the silence of night. It was now late, but the little mermaid could not tear herself away from the ship and the handsome young prince. She remained looking through the cabin window, rocked to and fro by the waves. There was a foaming and fermentation in the depths beneath, and the ship began to move on faster. The sails were spread, the waves rose high, thick clouds gathered in the sky, and the noise of distant thunder was heard. The sailors perceived that a storm was coming on, so they again furled the sails. The great vessel was tossed about on the tempestuous ocean like a light boat, and the waves rose to an immense height, towering over the ship, which alternately sank beneath and rose above them. To the little mermaid this seemed almost delightful, but the ship's crew thought very differently. The vessels cracked, the stout masts bent under the violence of the billows, the water rushed in. For a minute the ship tottered to and fro, and then the main mast broke, as if it had been a reed. The ship turned over and was filled with water. The little mermaid now perceived that the crew was in danger, for she herself was forced to be aware of the beams and splinters torn from the vessel and floating about on the waves. But at the same time it became pitch dark, so that she could not distinguish anything. Presently, however, a dreadful flash of lightning disclosed to her the whole of the wreck. Her eyes sought the young prince. At the same instant, the ship sank to the bottom. At first she was delighted, thinking that the prince must now come to her abode. But she soon remembered that man cannot live in water, and that, therefore, if the prince ever entered her palace, it would be as a corpse. Die? No, he must not die. She swam through the fragments with which the water had strewn, regardless of the danger she was incurring, and at last found the prince all but exhausted, and with great difficulty keeping his head above the water. He had already closed his eyes, and must inevitably have been drowned, had not the little mermaid come to his rescue. She seized hold of him and kept him above water, suffering the current to bear them on together. Towards morning, the storm was hushed. No trace, however, remained of the ship. The sun rose like fire out of the sea. His beams seemed to restore colour to the prince's cheeks, but his eyes were still closed. The mermaid kissed his high forehead and stroked his wet hair away from his face. He looked like the marble statue in her garden. She kissed him again and wished most fervently that he might recover. She now saw the dry land with its mountains glittering with snow. A green wood extended along the coast, and at the entrance of the wood stood a chapel or convent of which she could not be sure. Citron and lemon trees grew in the garden adjoining it. An avenue of tall palm trees led up to the door. The sea here formed a little bay, in which the water was quite smooth but very deep, and under the cliffs there were dry, firm sands. Hither swam the little mermaid with the seemingly dead prince. She laid him upon the warm sand, and took care to place his head high and to turn his face to the sun. The bells began to ring in the large white building which stood before her, and a number of young girls came out to walk in the garden. The mermaid went away from the shore, hid herself behind some stones, covered her head with foam so that her little face could not be seen, and watched the prince with unremitting attention. It was not long before one of the young girls approached. She seemed quite frightened at finding the prince in this state, apparently dead. Soon, however, she recovered herself and ran back to call her sisters. The little mermaid saw that the prince revived, and that all around smiled kindly and joyfully upon him. For her, however, he looked not. He knew not that it was she who had saved him. And when the prince was taken into the house, she felt so sad that she immediately plunged beneath the water and returned to her father's palace. If she had been quiet and thoughtful before, she now grew even more so. Her sisters asked her what she'd seen in the upper world, but she made no answer. Many an evening she rose to the place where she'd left the prince. She saw the snows on the mountains melt, the fruits in the garden ripen and gathered, but the prince she never saw, so she always returned sorrowfully to her subterranean abode. Her only pleasure was to sit in her little garden, gazing on the beautiful statue so like the prince. She cared no longer for her flowers, and they grew up in wild luxuriance, covering the steps and entwining their long stems and tendrils among the boughs of the trees, so that her whole garden became a bower. At last, being unable to conceal her sorrow any longer, she revealed the secret to one of her sisters, who told it to the other princesses, and they came to some of their friends. Among them was a young mermaid, who recollected the prince having been an eye-witness herself to the festivities on the ship. She knew also in what country the prince lived, and the name of its king. "Come, little sister," said the princesses, and embracing her, they rose together arm in arm out of the water, just in front of the prince's palace. This palace was built of bright yellow stones. A flight of white marble steps led from it down to the sea. A gilded cupola crowned the building, and white marble figures, which might almost have been taken for real men and women, were placed among the pillars surrounding it. Through the clear glass of the high windows, one might look into magnificent apartments hung with silken curtains. The walls were adorned with magnificent paintings. It was a real treat to the little royal mermaids to behold so splendid an abode. They gazed through the windows on one of the largest rooms, and in the centre saw a fountain playing, whose water sprang up so high as to reach the glittering cupola above, through which the sunbeams fell dancing on the water and brightening the pretty plants which grew around it. The little mermaid now knew where her beloved prince dwelt, and henceforth she went there almost every evening. She often approached nearer the land than her sisters had ventured, and even swam up the narrow channel that flowed under the marble balcony, and here, on a bright moonlit night, she would watch the young prince, who believed himself alone. Sometimes she saw him sailing on the water in a gaily painted boat with many coloured flags waving above. She would then hide among the green reeds which grew on the bank, listening to his voice, and if anyone in the boat noticed the rustling of her long silver veil, which was caught now and then by the light breeze, they only fancied it was a swan flapping its wings. Many a night, when the fishermen were casting their nets by the beacon's light, she heard them talking of the prince and relating the noble actions he had performed. She was then so happy, thinking how she had saved his life when struggling with the waves, and remembering how his head had rested on her bosom, and how she'd kissed him when he knew nothing of it, and could never even dream of such a thing. Human beings became more and more dear to her every day. She wished that she were one of them. Their world seemed to her so much larger than that of the Mer people. They could fly over the ocean in their ships, as well as climb to the summits of those high mountains that rose above the clouds, and their wooded domains extended much further than a mermaid's eye could penetrate. There were many things that she wished to hear explained, but her sisters could not give her any satisfactory answer, and she was again obliged to have recourse with the old Queen Mother, who knew a great deal about the upper world, which she used to call the country above the sea. "Do men, when they are not drowned, live forever?" she asked one day. "Do they not die as we do who live at the bottom of the sea?" "Yes," was the grandmother's reply. "They must die like us, and their life is much shorter than ours. We live to the age of 300 years, but when we die, we must become foam on the sea, and are not allowed even to share a grave among those that are dear to us. We have no immortal souls. We can never live again, and are like the grass which, when cut down, is withered forever. Human beings, on the contrary, have souls that continue to live when their bodies become dust. And as we rise out of the water to admire the abode of men, they ascend to glorious unknown dwellings in the skies, which we are not permitted to see." "Well, why have we not immortal souls?" asked the little mermaid. "I would willingly give up my 300 years to be a human being for just one day, thus to become entitled to that heavenly world above." "You must not think of that," answered her grandmother. "It is much better as it is. We live longer and are far happier than human beings." "So I must die, and be dashed like foam over the sea, never to rise again and hear the gentle murmur of the ocean, never again to see the beautiful flowers and the bright sun. Tell me, dear grandmother, are there no means by which I may obtain an immortal soul?" "No," replied the old lady. "It is true that if thou couldst so win the affections of a human being as to become dearer to him than either father or mother, if he loved thee with all of his heart, and promised while the priest joined his hands with thine to always be faithful to thee, then his soul would flow into thine, and thou wouldst become partaker of human bliss. But that can never be. For what in our eyes is the most beautiful part of our body, the tail, the inhabitants of the earth think hideous. They cannot bear it. To appear handsome to them, the body must have 2 clumsy props, which they call legs." The little mermaid sighed, and looked mournfully at the scaly part of her form, otherwise so fair and delicate. "We are happy," added the old lady. "We shall jump and swim about merrily for 300 years. That is a long time. And afterwards we shall repose peacefully in death. This evening we will have a court ball." The ball which the Queen Mother spoke of was far more splendid than any the earth has ever seen. The walls of the saloon were of crystal, very thick, but yet very clear. Hundreds of large mussel shells were planted in rows along them. These shells were some of rose colour, some green as grass, but all sending forth a bright light, which not only illuminated the whole apartment, but also shone through the glassy walls so as to light up the waters around for a great space, and making the scales of the numberless fish, great and small, crimson and purple, silver and golden coloured, they appeared more brilliant than ever. Through the centre of the saloon flowed a bright, clear stream, on the surface of which danced mermen and mermaids to the melody of their own sweet voices, voices far sweeter than any of those dwellers upon earth. The little princess sang more harmoniously than any other, and they clapped their hands and applauded her. She was pleased at this, for she knew well that there was neither on earth nor in the sea a more beautiful voice than hers. But her thoughts soon returned to the world above her. She could not forget the handsome prince. She could not control her sorrow at not having an immortal soul. She stole away from her father's palace, and whilst all was joy within, she sat alone, lost in thought in her little neglected garden. On a sudden, she heard the tones of horns resounding over the water far away in the distance, and she said to herself, "Now he's going out to hunt, he whom I love more than my father and mother, with whom my thoughts are constantly occupied, and to whom I would so willingly trust the happiness of my life. All will I risk to win him and an immortal soul. Whilst my sisters are still dancing in the palace, I will go to the enchantress to whom I have hitherto feared so much, but who is nevertheless the only person who can advise and help me." What will that enchantress do? Will the little mermaid get to spend some time with her prince? I think it's all a bit risky. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time. Bye.